Falls. It's Steve Caparotta here from the First Alert Storm Center. We continue to track lots of action out in the tropics. 3 hurricanes simultaneously, as we talked about yesterday. That's the first time that's happened since 2010, 7 years ago. And it was right about this time in September in 2010 that we had, I think it was Igor, Julia, and Carl all ongoing. And there's been a great image circulating on social media this morning. Not only was it also the I, J, and K storms like we had, but they were in very similar locations, same time of year. Pretty crazy how that worked out. All right, here's a look at Irma on the 3D visible satellite. And man, this is just something you hate to see. We've got another area about to take a direct hit, and that would be the Turks and Caicos Islands. The eye is approaching this afternoon, so this is going to be another devastating blow. And when we start talking about these islands from the Turks and Caicos extending up into the Bahamas, you're talking about areas that don't sit much above sea level. So there is going to be many of these islands going completely underwater, quite a bit of storm surge. The forecast includes 15 to 20 feet of storm surge in some areas. Now on the satellite at times this afternoon, it's been pretty steady state through the day. At times, the last couple of hours, it's looked like it may be trying to get a little bit better organized once again. But overall, no significant changes, even though the winds have come down slightly over the last 12 to 18 hours. Here's a look at it on the high resolution visible. And again, you can see how the eye is moving directly towards these islands of the Turks and Caicos. So that's a double whammy because you get all the water that I talked about, but you're also going to get in on the most severe winds, and we're just now starting to get some pictures in from some of the northern Leeward Islands that took the direct hit, and when you see the damage, it's incredible, but not surprising when you think about just how high the winds have been. A little bit of good news here is that it stayed north of Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. Haiti in particular, an area that is very flood prone, still getting in on the rains, so we will have to see how they make out. Now, another bit of new information that came out this morning with the 10 o'clock advisory, South Florida, here in orange, now under a hurricane watch. I'm really telling you, we're about to hit game time here in South Florida. It's getting serious. Hurricane warnings pretty much now extending the length of the Bahamas as well. All right, here are the stats as of 1 p.m. Maximum winds 175 miles per hour. The pressure today is just a little bit higher than it was yesterday, and with that, winds have come down a little bit. You remember they peaked at 185, stayed at 185 for quite a long time, but still 175. Think about this. Well, while they're down, that 175 matches the peak intensity of the winds of Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 when it was in the central Gulf of Mexico. Still moving steadily off to the west-northwest at 16. So the forecast track takes it across the Turks and Caicos. Many of the islands, especially of the southeastern and central Bahamas, will get in on the bad right front quadrant of the storm. The forecast keeps this a 5 or Category 4 as it nears Cuba and South Florida. We cannot rule out that this could still be a Category 5 as it nears South Florida by the weekend. So this forecast point, if you can't read it, this is Sunday morning. And please pay attention. I'm going to show you why you need to pay attention to the cone on this and the realm of possibilities and not the exact track there. One other thing we'll continue to watch that we've talked about for days. Does the center at any point move over Cuba, or does it stay just north? If it moves over Cuba for a little bit, that could weaken it a little bit. But if it stays out over the water, obviously, we wouldn't expect much weakening. From there, Sunday morning near South Florida, a general track to the north, and we may actually see a bend back to the northwest. Later on in the forecast, here's Monday, and then by Tuesday morning, probably by Monday afternoon or evening, it would be inland. Now, some of the other tracks really keep this in, take it inland Sunday morning into South Florida and move it right over the peninsula. So it could be inland for quite some time. We may not see sort of a second landfall depending on exactly how this tracks. We now also have a storm surge watch in South Florida. So it's a new product from the National Hurricane Center that is to alert people to the potential of life-threatening rising water. And what they're warning of right now is potentially 5 to 10 feet of, not actually storm surge, it's the actual storm surge number, probably a little bit higher, 5 to 10 feet of inundation, 5 to 10 feet of water above ground level in these areas. So, you know what, I'm 5'9", so you're talking about a minimum of water up here and then going up to 10 feet. All right, let me give you a look now at the spaghetti plots. And we're going to pause here. This is around lunchtime on Saturday. Even 48 hours from now, you start to see a little bit of a spread. Some of the models are near the northwestern Bahamas, still over water, but there are some that bring this over Cuba. So that would certainly be bad news for Cuba, but that would be, I do mean a little bit, but that would just be a little bit of good news for South Florida if we get it over Cuba and can weaken it a little bit before it makes the expected turn. But indeed, the model's all still showing that right turn. Here we are Sunday morning, pretty good cluster in the general vicinity of Miami, but we've got some out here in the Florida Straits near the Florida Keys, farther down to the southwest. And then you can see the models start to kind of come together over the Florida Peninsula. Some are a bit faster, taking it up towards Georgia or South Carolina by early next week. And you can also see this bend back to the northwest as it starts to move inland. Now here's a look at the, we'll step you through now, the GFS and the European, their main model runs. So this is the GFS that we start you out with. We pause now Saturday morning, and it is just off the coast of Cuba. We'll advance now to Sunday morning, and on the GFS, it's been pretty steady in this for a few runs. It's got the center very close, but just offshore of Miami. So keep in mind, depending on, under a scenario like this, if we kept the eye wall offshore, that saves Miami a little bit from the worst. They're still going to take a big hit. But if that eye wall comes ashore in these areas, that just really magnifies and drives up the damage potential from this storm. And then also, this is just such a dangerous track because if it stays just offshore, you know, much like Matthew last year, we have some damage, but it may not be catastrophic. But if this comes in from the south of the peninsula and tracks over much of the peninsula, then you're talking about just one of the storm. It's just a hard to imagine scenario because you're talking about big impacts in Miami, Orlando, potentially Tampa, and then extending all the way up to Jacksonville. So all the big cities in the Florida Panhandle, and I didn't even name them all. You know, you have Fort Lauderdale, Sarasota, Fort Myers, but they could all be under the gun under certain tracks. All right, so by Sunday evening now, it's got it just off sort of the space coast of Florida. By Monday morning, it's got nearing next landfall either along the coast of Georgia or South Carolina, not far from, say, Savannah and Hilton Head, South Carolina, by Monday afternoon, and then you see it moving inland. And then we start to keep an eye on Jose showing up out here in the Atlantic. You see Jose kind of meanders for a while, and on the GFS at least eventually gets pulled up to the northeast. And as I showed you yesterday, the models are showing next week there may be yet another system coming off of Africa that we'll be tracking, but we'll deal with that when it happens because it's not even there yet. Now here's a look at the European. So here we are right now. We'll fast forward to Saturday morning. This is pretty close to what the GFS shows for Saturday morning. Maybe a touch farther south and west, but not much. And I'll actually show you a comparison of these two models on the same map in a second, give you a better idea of the differences. And then here's the big news of the day today so far. The latest European model has come out in the last hour or two, and it's come in a bit west. So this would be really bad news for Florida because this is kind of that scenario I was talking about where you're now bringing just about all of the peninsula into really bad stuff in essence. So it brings it over the Florida Keys and a landfall closer to southwest Florida under this latest model run. And then notice this, it takes it straight up the Florida Peninsula. So by Sunday evening, it's just northwest of Miami. It rolls right on by Orlando, and by Monday morning, we're up here in northern parts of the Florida Peninsula, say between Gainesville and Jacksonville. And then you can see it taking up actually into southwest Georgia. This is also a westward trend, even on the end by Monday evening, and then continuing up to the north and weakening Tuesday. Here is Jose on the European. Now watch Jose on the European model. It kind of keeps it meandering out here for a while, loops it back. Almost shows a window for this to come back in the general direction of the United States. We'll keep an eye on that because the models are going back and forth on that potential, and we are now starting to talk 9-10 days out. So a lot of uncertainty, but also notice it also shows that other system very similar to the GFS developing out here in the Atlantic. So things are going to stay pretty busy. Here are the GFS ensembles. We've talked about this each and every day. So you run the main model, and then you tweak the initial conditions, run it 20 other times, and get some alternative scenarios. Here we are Saturday morning, and on the ensembles, you already see a decent spread from the northwestern Bahamas, some of them bringing it over Cuba. And then as we get into Sunday morning, that's a pretty big spread here. For now, we're getting in, 60 or so hours out. You've got some of the ensemble members that are tracking it north over the northwestern Bahamas, some that even try to sneak it here into the eastern Gulf of Mexico. But the majority are either near the east coast of Florida, or some are over the Florida Peninsula, with fewer out here over the open Atlantic. And we also see that bend back to the northwest as we get into the early part of next week. Now here's a look at the European ensembles. Again, we've seen the westward shift, okay, today. So this westward shift, I want to caution, we're broadcasting from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This westward shift is not enough to really get us concerned in Louisiana. I need to emphasize that. What is more concerning about this is just the greater damage potential, greater impact potential for more of the Florida Peninsula under a scenario like this. So that's what really has us bothered. But I know it may be a little bit hard to make out on this map. But Miami's right about down in here, and the majority, now remember with the European ensembles we get roughly 50, the majority of the tracks now take the system over quite a bit of the Florida Peninsula. That's an ugly scenario, no doubt about it, and we do have a handful that actually bring the system out into the eastern Gulf of Mexico, so we can't rule that out yet. So that's something we're going to be tracking, but certainly it's not a huge, but it's a significant westward shift that we've seen from the European over the last 12 to 24 hours. There's just a zoomed-in view how most of those are now kind of focused over the Florida Peninsula. So that's something we're going to be tracking closely. All right, here's another way of comparing the two models, the European and the GFS. The European's in blue. The GFS, the so-called American model, is in red. So right now, at the starting time, they're going to have the center in about the right spot. Now, as we fast forward, here we are Friday evening. We're already starting to see some subtle differences, but it's pretty small. The European is a little bit southwest. The European in blue is just a little bit southwest of where the GFS is at that point. But those small differences add up over time. Right, so that's why we need to pay attention to them. So as we get to Saturday morning, the spread hasn't increased a whole lot, but the European is still running southwest of the GFS. It's not far off the coast of Cuba, so that's why we can't discount that this could move inland into Cuba for a little while and potentially weaken. But we start to see the turn here during the day on Saturday by the GFS. The turn is happening quicker on the GFS than it is on the European. We're starting to see a bigger spread on the two, with the European clearly farther to the west. And then here's a good illustration of the potential differing tracks near South Florida by Sunday morning. The European near the southwest coast of Florida, kind of near the Florida Keys, if you will. And the GFS, the center, is technically just offshore in this run. So that's why anybody in the Florida Peninsula needs to be taking this very seriously. There you see now Sunday evening, the European is taking it up the Florida Peninsula. So Here's one other smaller point, but if we get a track like the European that's a little farther south and west, that's going to slow down the timeline a little bit here in Florida. You can notice how the European is now here, the GFS is here, it's southwest of it, so that could change the timing just a little bit. But at this point, the GFS is still offshore, and the European is running right over the spine of the Florida Peninsula. Monday morning, the European is still right over the Florida Peninsula, whereas the GFS is offshore of Jacksonville, pretty similar to where Hurricane Matthew was last year. And then by Monday, they're both moving inland and taking that turn up to the northwest, and you see the spread that shows up out here in the Atlantic between the European in blue and the GFS in red with Jose. So a little bit of a disagreement there also. Now in terms of tropical storm force winds, here's a look at the timing on that. So as we get to Saturday morning, by Saturday morning, here in the yellow, we're starting to get into a 30 to 40% chance of tropical storm force winds near Miami as soon as Saturday morning. So that's why evacuations are well underway now in and around Miami and much of South Florida, because we're now in a window where we could start to see tropical storm force winds in the next 36 hours or so, the way this is shaping up right now. And then as we hit Saturday evening, those chances in Miami are now in the 50 to 60% range, and even higher odds just offshore. But even up around Orlando, we're now getting into a 10 to 20% chance of tropical storm force winds by Saturday evening. And then as we hit Sunday afternoon, chances of tropical storm force winds, they're running 80 to 90% in Miami. Look for these numbers to go up and go up a little more quickly as we get a little more certainty on the forecast track. The only reason that's not pegging 100 in Miami right now is we still need to nail down the exact forecast track, but these numbers more than likely will go up with each forecast cycle that comes out going forward. And then you see how those probabilities trend north as we head into the early part of next week. Now, under the last forecast track, you had a 50 to 60% chance from, say, Savannah, Georgia, up towards Charleston, Myrtle Beach, even as far inland as Columbia, South Carolina. We'll see what they do. May have to shift that just a tiny bit west if they give a little bit of deference to the European model. The European, there is a site that tracks how the models have performed so far on this storm, and so far the European has done best. There's one caveat to that. The European has fewer model cycles than most of the other models, so it's got a smaller sample size. So in other words, it's had fewer opportunities to kind of miss and make a mistake, if that makes sense. But if you take the average forecast error so far, the European has been essentially winning on the forecast. Here's a look at the hurricane wind probabilities now as we go forward in time. And we'll watch these move through the Turks and Caicos, the Bahamas. Saturday morning, not quite showing any chance of hurricane force winds yet in South Florida. Small odds getting close to the Florida Keys, though. But as we get into Sunday morning, you notice by that time Miami under a 30 to 40% chance of hurricane force winds. And then as we advance deeper into the day, a 40 to 50% chance of hurricane. And remember, these are sustained hurricane force winds in Miami. These numbers almost certainly will go up in Florida as more of the forecast cycles come out. And again, you see those probabilities going northward. Here's an interesting look at the wind field. This is our RPM model, and even it struggles to show how intense the hurricane is right now. If you can't make this out, the blues are tropical storm force winds. These are wind gusts, not sustained, but gusts. Green is Category 1, yellow Category 2, orange Category 3, red Cat 4, and purple or pink Category 5. Right now it only shows wind gusts in a small area of Category 3, but we know right now this is a Category 5 hurricane. So the model's even struggling to show the intensity of what we are sampling out there right now. Interesting to note here as we go forward in time, not only the track of the system here between the Bahamas and Cuba, but did you notice this model seems to show the wind field getting larger in time? Man, we don't want to see that, and some of the models have hinted at that possibility. So not only could we be looking at a very powerful hurricane, but the wind field could be growing in size, just magnifying, amplifying the impacts to a larger area. So that's another trend to watch. Now, this particular model is closer to what the GFS shows. It shows a harder right turn sooner and keeps the eye. Assuming this is, I think we can go a little farther out in time, but notice right now it's between, and I should know my Bahamian Islands better than this. I forget which one that is. Man, I'm drawing a blank. But between Miami and the Northwest Bahamas, and then it essentially keeps the eye just offshore. So again, that's one scenario. The European is over here. So we see how that plays out on the wind field. Let's talk a little bit about the steering now, and the thinking behind the steering really hasn't changed much. There's still an area of high pressure steering this off to the west-northwest, but I think you can see this big trough over the east coast. So what that's doing is that's starting to weaken the area of high pressure a bit over the western Atlantic, but not enough to just pull it out to sea. This trough is going to start to lift out, unfortunately not in time to capture Irma and take it out over the open Atlantic before it impacts the United States. We're still keeping an eye on a singular key feature that looks to steer this going forward. Starting to show up just a little bit better today on the water vapor loop. Can you make out this little twist right here from Wyoming into Nebraska, now headed into northeastern Colorado? That's the upper air disturbance we've been talking about, expected to drop down to the southeast. It'll set up shop somewhere here over the deep south, and as it spins its counterclockwise flow, Irma gets drawn up on the east side of it. So the only question here is just kind of where does that set up, and the timing on where it sets up and when it sets up and how that interacts with Irma. But we're still essentially looking at the same steering features. I showed this yesterday, mid-levels of the atmosphere. This shows spin. Here's our big upper-level trough over the eastern half of the country. You'll watch how that starts to lift out to the north. Here comes that little small disturbance dropping southeast. This is Friday evening now with Irma near the coast of Cuba. So at this point, not really feeling the impacts of either of those two features. Neither one of them really tugging it to the north just yet. As we get into Saturday evening, this is the European. That trough is basically lifted out on the east coast, and it hasn't really made the turn yet, whereas some of the other models at this point are starting the right turn. So the European is basically saying it's going to take a little bit longer for this to feel the impact of this little upper disturbance, upper low, if you will, kind of centered over Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama by Saturday evening. But by Sunday, as that upper low spins over the deep south, it starts to draw Irma up to the north, and then by Monday, if you can imagine that circulation still going, it kind of slingshots it inland, pulling it a bit to the northwest. That's why you see that motion like that. So, of course, Irma is not the only game in town. I want to mention we're going to touch on Irma and Katia, and then we'll get to some of your questions. I ran a little graphic sequence earlier this afternoon for about an hour, hour and a half, and asked you to post your questions. I jotted down some of those. We'll run through those, but also you can post some of your questions in the comments section. So Irma, obviously, and look at Jose now. Jose looks to be intensifying pretty rapidly. We've now got an eye that's showing up quite clearly, and unfortunately, this one looks like it's really getting its act together. And in fact, I need to update the time on my graphic, but this is now a Category 2 hurricane as of 1 p.m. Maximum winds up to 105 miles per hour. It's moving to the west-northwest at 18. Here's another, as if there's not enough going on. Forecast to become a Category 3 by tomorrow morning, tracking up to the west-northwest. And look at this track. Look how close it is to some of the very same islands that were just hit so hard by Irma. Could be under the gun once again days later as we get into the weekend. So you hate to see this, but it's a very real scenario. So this is going to delay the cleanup. It's probably going to delay the ability of outside help to come in because you have to fly in these islands, obviously, for real significant aid. So we're just going to have to see the exact details of this track. Hopefully most of them stay on the left side, which is typically weaker, but still some significant impacts possible. And then the forecast shows Jose turning northward and starting to weaken a bit. The thinking here is that conditions get a little less favorable through time into early next week. Some of that may be related to, now if you can think about a hurricane, at the lower levels, it has a counterclockwise flow, but at the upper levels, it actually likes high pressure, which is a clockwise flow. There's going to be some outflow from Irma, and that may produce some wind shear over the Atlantic, which may knock down Jose a bit. We'll see. But again, we're talking 5 days on down the line, so we've got plenty of time to watch it. Here's a look at the spaghetti plots on it. And you can see most of the models are just northeast of the island, but at least a few bring it over a few of those islands. We'll watch it, and then you notice the turn back to the right, some of them turning it back to the south, and even indicating that potential for a loop. So that's why we may be watching Jose for a while into next week. And finally, here's Katia in the Gulf of Mexico. No big changes here. It's just kind of sitting and spinning over the Bay of Campeche right now. We do have a hurricane warning up for the state of Veracruz in Mexico. Maximum winds on Katia, 80 miles per hour. It's stationary at the moment, but forecast to start moving to the southwest. Notice forecast says could become a Category 2. Moves inland into Mexico, though. This is by Friday night or Saturday morning. So that's all I had on those three storms. So now if you want, go ahead and post some questions. Excuse me. Now I'm going to run through a few of the questions that you guys posted earlier. Vicky asked, could Jose make it into the Gulf? We can't say yes or no. We can't say no on that at this point. If it were to make it into the Gulf, if it were ever to make it into the Gulf, it's on down the line a bit. Our models that go out through 10 days still have Jose out in the Atlantic. So if that were to happen, it's beyond 10 days. So we can't really answer that with any confidence at all as of yet. But it's probably a small chance when you think about a system being out there that long. There are a number of troughs that come off the East Coast, and the most likely scenario would be something would pick it up at some point. But we'll have to see. Debbie asked, any chance Irma won't turn? No, the turn is pretty much a certainty. It's just a question of exactly when. But there's nothing, need to emphasize at this point, that shows it coming as far west as Louisiana. I never say never, so I always tell people just keep checking back the next couple of days, make sure something crazy hasn't happened, but we don't see that happening. We don't see anything making this a threat to us. Christina asked, could Jose merge with Irma? We don't really see mergers of these storms. Essentially, there's three options that could happen. Option one is Irma and Jose remain their own independent entities, don't really influence each other that much, and that's that. Option two is Jose gets too close to Irma, and Irma starts to weaken it, and Jose falls apart. Now, sometimes you can kind of find some hints that one storm weakens the other and then absorbs a little bit of the energy, but it's not like it gets this big turbo boost if that happens. So in terms of it really absorbing it, not really. And then the third least likely scenario is something called the Fujiwara effect, where two storms can kind of rotate about a common axis, where they're kind of rotating around each other. That's not likely to happen in this case. That's mostly been observed in the Pacific, but those are the three possibilities. Marcienne says, I hope I got your name right. Any update on the Turks and Caicos? No, unfortunately I don't. And I'm going to imagine it's going to be hard to hear much out of there for the next day or two. You got to think a lot of the communications are going to go down. It's going to be a bad hit there, but I haven't heard anything specifically out of the Turks and Caicos. Christopher asked, does Louisiana have anything to worry about really with either of the systems? In terms of Irma, we're not really concerned about it here in Louisiana. And then, as I said, Jose is so far away, we'll just keep an eye on it, but not really worried about this point. Katie had a Disney vacation plan from September 9th to September 16th. So was today the 7th? Yeah, so 2 days from now. Katie, I would think, I know it's always difficult, but I think you're going to have to try and cancel that one if you can. Especially if anything close to that European model track pans out, Orlando would take a significant hit. Now, if we get something closer to what Matthew did last year, Orlando weathered it pretty well, where you got the system that's just offshore the East Coast. So it's tough, but the wisdom here would be cancel to be safe, because it could get ugly. I don't know if Disney's put out any official word yet on what they're doing, but if this European ends up being right at all, could be nasty in Orlando. And then finally, Teresa asked, chances it doesn't turn. We just don't see anything that doesn't show a turn. The turn is likely to happen. It's just the exact details of that turn that we're waiting to see and iron out in the coming days. All right. Let's see if you guys have any other questions before I wrap this up. Give me a second to refresh the pages. So we will have a new advisory out here shortly from the National Hurricane Center. New advisories on all three systems, but I know everyone is most interested in Irma right now. I was just looking to see if, let's see, we do have something out on Jose. Let me see if what we've got on that. Try to see where the wind speeds are on this one. Bear with me for 1 second. Maximum sustained winds 105 knots. So I think that's just shy of Category 3. Let me take a look. Let's just do this. We're going to pull our Jose graphic back up. Since we've got a new advisory in on that, and we'll give you a look at the latest on it. So many graphics to sort through. Let me just find the right one. I will get it up for you here in just a second. All right, so we're going to pull up Jose since we have a new advisory rolling in on it. So winds up to 120, so that's good. That's going to make this a Cat 3 now. So that makes it now 3 straight major hurricanes in the Atlantic that we have in terms of Harvey, Irma, and Jose. So there you see it. Maximum winds 120 miles per hour, moving west-northwest at 18. Here's the official forecast track. Looks like no big changes, but again, we've got it awfully close to the northern Lesser Antilles over the weekend. And then you can see the hints of what could be this meandering motion south of, that's Bermuda right there, south of Bermuda, as we head on into next week. So another major hurricane now with Jose. All right, let's see. Anything else? That's kind of a good question. Kathy's asking, why didn't Katia kind of get caught up by the cold front? That's pretty good. So we're talking about cold fronts. We're talking about largely what's happening down here at the surface, at ground level. And there's a connection to what's happening up above us. But the trough, that upper level trough that's driving the cold front, doesn't extend as far south as the actual cold front does, if that makes any sense at all. So the trough, the upper level trough, would have to be just a little farther south to pick Katia up. But that's a good question. How many named hurricanes were predicted this year? Well, those forecasts, they change continuously. But the most recent forecasts from all groups were for an above average season. When would St. Pete get hit? So I think we're looking later in the day on Sunday is when things would be ramping up in St. Pete. Let's get back to our Irma track here. Yeah, so Sunday afternoon, potentially over South Florida and headed north, so things would be ramping up during the day in St. Petersburg, Florida. Okay. And let's take one other peek for questions, and I'm going to wrap it up because I'm going to get busy now updating the latest set of graphics on all these tropical systems, looking at the new information, and getting ready for a 5 o'clock broadcast also. So we've got lots going on, obviously, this afternoon. All right, I'm taking one more peek down just to see if you guys had anything. It looks like those are the main questions. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in again. We will probably do this again tomorrow afternoon, either at 2 or 3. We'll give you a little bit of advance notice, try to let you know, just so we can update you on the latest with Irma, expected impacts. But understand this could be a really devastating hurricane, especially for parts of Florida. So we're going to have to watch it closely. I'll see you back on air at 5 o'clock.